Audio recording for this meeting has begun.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us for today's webinar, the 2017 Administration's Budget and What It Means for Rural Housing. My name is Shanteria Charleston, HAC's Training Manager, and I will be your host for today's call. If you've not already done so, please ensure that you have access to both the audio and video portion of the webinar. To access the PowerPoint for today's call, please follow the link on your meeting confirmation email. All participants are in listen-only mode, which means your line is muted. However, we are very interested in your questions as well as your feedback. So today, to submit a question, please use the chat box that appears on the lower right-hand side of your screen. If you are having technical difficulties, please private chat me, as we want to keep the chat that appears on the screen open for specific webinar-related questions. Again, today's webinar is being recorded. Both the recording and PowerPoint will be available on HAC's website, www.ruralhome.org, shortly following the webinar. So I see a lot of familiar names today. But for those of you that are not familiar with the Housing Assistance Council, HAC is a national nonprofit organization based in Washington, D.C. that assists local organizations with building affordable homes in rural America. With the mission to improve housing conditions for the rural poor, HAC places a special emphasis on striving to serve the poorest of the poor in the most rural places. HAC emphasizes local solutions, empowerment of the poor, reduced dependency, and self-help strategies. HAC assists with the development of both single and multifamily homes and promotes home ownership for working low-income rural families through a self-help sweat equity construction method. Interested in learning more about HAC services or products? HAC has an office near you. If you have questions or require assistance, please contact your nearest HAC regional offices. Those office locations are being displayed on the screen. They will also be provided as part of the follow-up material on HAC's website shortly following the call. Also, please mark your calendar and join us for the following training. We have a couple of webinars that are coming up. We have Duty to Serve and What It Means for Rural America taking place on tomorrow. We have Community Reinvestment Act in Rural America, that's on February 25th, as well as the second part of CRA taking place on March 16th. We're also hosting Advanced Financial Management as well as the Section 502 Packaging Training for Nonprofit Developers in North Charleston, South Carolina over March 8th through 10th. We also have coming up the Serving Americans Aging Veterans, a symposium that's taking place in Washington, D.C. on May 18th. So again, I'd like to thank you for joining us for today's webinar, the 2017 Administration's Budget and What It Means for Rural Housing. I'd like to welcome and introduce our speakers for today, Leslie Strauss and Stephen Sugg. Leslie is HAC's Senior Policy Analyst and is responsible for a variety of policy and information activities, including much of HAC's work on rental housing preservation. Leslie holds a JD from the University of Cincinnati College of Law and practiced real estate law in Washington, D.C. before joining HAC. Our second speaker for today is Stephen Sugg. Stephen is HAC's Manager of Government Relations and Housing Specialist. Stephen holds a doctorate degree in education from the College of William and Mary. And so at this point, I will turn the webinar over to Leslie and Stephen.
Hi everyone, this is Leslie Strauss. I hope you can hear me. Type something in the chat if I'm not clear enough. I'm going to talk about USDA rural development, and the first thing we wanted to do is a poll to find out. I'm guessing, since like Terry, I recognize a lot of the names among the attendees, I'm guessing that a lot of people are familiar with the USDA programs, but I want to get a quick sense of that. results climbing rapidly.
Faster in Iowa.
We have no not familiar at all. Okay, that might be everybody. Coming in. It's about 50-50 between very familiar and somewhat familiar. So the next few slides before I start talking about the budget are sort of background information on USDA's programs. Which include both single-family and multifamily, or homeownership and rental. These are, what you see on the slide right now, are the basic single-family programs. There's a couple of self-help specific, well, Section 502 is not specific to self-help, but is often used for it. These are the numbers for those. I'll talk separately about homeownership and rental programs. The administration's budget, as you can see in the column to the far right, asks for about the same amount of funding for single-family programs, except for Section 523 self-help technical assistance. That's grants that go to local organizations that run self-help housing programs. And there is supposed to be some carryover money for 523 self-help from past years, so that the amount actually available would be somewhat higher than 18.5 million, but not enough to get it up to the full 27.5. There's not really any explanation in the budget as to why they want to cut the program. It says in fiscal 15 and presumably in fiscal 16, they will produce about 840 units of self-help housing with the 27.5 million. And with this amount for fiscal 17, even with the carryover, it would go down to about 600 units. And just kind of gives those numbers and doesn't say anything further about why that's a good idea. For multifamily, there are production programs, rental assistance programs, preservation programs, and direct loans. I'm sorry, I'm clicking on the wrong thing. I don't know if you all saw that or not, but I did a couple of incorrect clicks when I was trying to advance the slide. Sorry. Most of the multifamily programs, like single family, are the same, proposed to be the same as for fiscal 16. The Section 538 program, which shows a big jump from 150 million to 230 million, is self-supporting through fees. It's not, doesn't really require much in the way of appropriation. So that jump sort of could happen without taking money away from anything else. There's a slight increase in Section 515, which I will talk about in a second, reasons for that. Rental assistance, which is Section 521. For those who aren't familiar with it, it's kind of like HUD project-based assistance. It's attached to USDA-funded properties. Not all USDA-funded properties have rental assistance, but all rental assistance is on buildings that have USDA mortgages, either 515, which is basic rental, general rental housing, or 514, which is farm worker housing. The administration proposes an increase for fiscal 17. It doesn't really matter. The dollar amount between 16 and 17 doesn't really tell you anything, because the fiscal 15 amount was short, and the fiscal 16 amount has extra money in it that was to make up for contracts that weren't fully funded in fiscal 15, if that makes sense. And we can go into that in more detail if anybody wants to, but presumably all rental assistance contracts that exist will be fully funded in the current fiscal year, which is fiscal 16, and the budget proposes to renew all the outstanding contracts for fiscal 17. In the past couple of years, people probably know that the President's budget requested minimum rent, $50 per rental assistance unit, and had a couple of administrative sounding proposals, only one of which got adopted in fiscal 15, which was a prohibition on what are called re-renewals of contracts. That's rental assistance contracts that run out of money before the full one-year term of the contract ends. And that provision was put in last year's appropriation and caused havoc, to make a longer story short. So this year, fortunately, they are not requesting that or the other administrative kinds of changes that they wanted in the rental assistance program. The $1.4 billion that's requested for rental assistance would go for four different pieces, four different things in this list on the slide that you see. One is to renew outstanding units. One is, the budget says that it will provide rental assistance for a modest amount of new construction farm labor housing. That's section 514, 516, farm worker housing. It will continue rental assistance for properties with maturing mortgages that stay in USDA's portfolio, and I'll talk more about maturing mortgage issues in a minute. And some amount of it would be used for preservation. The budget explanation says rental assistance can help support additional debt service resulting from MPR or other loans used to renovate housing. It's not clear to me whether that means providing additional rental assistance, but there is language that would add rental assistance to one of the things you're allowed to do under the MPR preservation program, which has a bunch of tools that can be used, and rental assistance would become one of them. Before I go more into preservation, I just want to point out I tried to calculate the dollar amounts that the budget suggested for individual. It has 286,108 renewal units. It says that they will cost approximately $4,911 each for the year. When you multiply that out, you get $43,000. That's $43,000, not a million, more than the actual budget amount requested. That's the value of about 9 units. It's not clear to me whether that's significant. As of September 2015, there were a little over, well, almost 271,000 rental assistance units, and they were calculating that they would have enough money with this budget request for 286,000. So I'm guessing that that rental assistance amount is enough to do all of the things that they want to do with it. The bottom line from all of those numbers. Preservation programs, this is to keep properties affordable for low-income tenants, even when owners need to refinance or want to sell the properties or want to prepay their mortgages. There's a multifamily preservation and revitalization demonstration program, which is better known as NPR. There's a revolving loan fund, and the USDA has its own voucher program, Section 542, These are the dollar amounts proposed in the budget for those. The budget and appropriations for the last few years have not funded the Preservation Revolving Loan Fund. Because it's a revolving fund, the entities, HAC is one of them, full disclosure, the entities that received money from this fund to make loans for preservation purposes presumably still have some. HAC certainly does have some. If anyone wants to investigate that further, let us know. The budget calls for a little bit less than the current year in NPR funding and $3 million more in Section 542 vouchers. It says that the amount that's budgeted for NPR, again, that's $19.4 million, and a portion of the amount proposed for Section 515, it doesn't say exactly how much of that 515, are expected to preserve approximately 3,500 affordable housing units in 2017, which is about the number that's been preserved the last couple of years, I believe. A separate issue from preservation, although it overlaps, is maturing mortgages. People may have heard about this recently. USDA mortgages were 50 or 30-year terms, and they were made, the loans were made 30 to 50 years ago. So they're starting to come up on the end of their loan terms. USDA's budget says that 11,500 units could leave the program in the next 8 years. When the mortgage is paid off, then the rental or income restrictions for tenants go away. What they propose to do about this is provide some unspecified amount in rental assistance. That's why the second sub-bullet there just has a dollar sign and no amount. It doesn't say how much rental assistance would go for this. And $3 million in vouchers. Rental assistance would be used for tenants in properties where USDA is able to do something with the mortgage, refinance it, or provide the owner with a new mortgage, something that would keep it in USDA's portfolio. Remember, rental assistance is tied to the existence of a USDA mortgage. So if a mortgage, even if the mortgage only has $1,000 left to pay, if the term is extended, if it's re-amortized, then it can still receive, the property can still receive rental assistance. If the property leaves USDA's portfolio, if the mortgage is in fact paid off, what USDA is proposing to do is offer vouchers to those tenants. That's the second set of bullets on this slide. Currently, USDA's vouchers are available only in Section 515 properties when the mortgage has been prepaid, not paid off in the ordinary course of time. They're proposing legislative language that would allow the properties with maturing mortgages to be eligible, tenants to be eligible for vouchers, which can be used either in the USDA, former USDA property, or somewhere else as long as the landlord will accept it. And USDA would be able to set priorities. That kind of language was proposed in the budget last year. It wasn't adopted by Congress, so we're not entirely sure how that might work. But the language, the legislative language they proposed says, based on prioritization as determined by the Secretary meaning USDA. I mentioned that the amount of rental assistance that might be used for that is unspecified. This is something that HAC has been paying a lot of attention to, and I'm curious for those of you who are in the audience, this is our second poll for the day. Are maturing mortgage properties an issue in your part of the country? Yes, no, not sure. Not still awake. have a lot of not sures, which I think is a reflection of the fact that USDA has not made information readily available about which properties mortgages are going to mature when. It's harder to figure out than you would think. And they did put out a list. If folks didn't see that when it came out in the Hack News or have an interest in finding out more about the list that exists, which only goes, I'm sorry, I don't remember what year it goes through, but it's only a few years in advance. It doesn't cover the entire portfolio of mortgages. Contact me after the webinar, leslie@ruralhome.org, and I can get the list to you that USDA has put out. I am going to turn this over to Stephen to talk about HUD and to talk about what the budget actually is.
Thank you, Leslie. And it looks like they gave a lot of good information about USDA. I'm going to spend a little bit less time on specific to HUD. I do want to offer a quick reminder to folks in the last few days and speaking to folks in the field and here at HAC and elsewhere about the budget, the President's budget. Just a quick reminder that this is just a proposal. This is the President's desired blueprint for spending, and it's up to Congress to actually write the check. So this budget will go to Congress, and Congress will consider it. Cabinet secretaries will testify before Congress, and it goes through the appropriations process. And so just keep that in mind. These are proposals, and these are not set in stone yet. And as you all might have heard on television, the partisan rancor in D.C. is a bit high right now. And Republicans have not been super receptive to most parts of the President's budget. But we will see. We haven't been receptive to the President's budget, but it is a starting point for these issues. So with that said, what are they proposing for HUD? Well, first of all, a quick reminder that HUD is we call it Department of Housing and Urban Development. HUD has a rural presence, and it always has. And between public housing, Section 8, former programs that were focused on rural areas in HUD, which we'll talk about later, Section 202, HUD does have a rural reach, and as Secretary Castro said last week, HUD could just be as easily called Department of Housing and Opportunity. And Secretary Castro will also emphasize HUD's reach to communities of all sizes. And as we look at the HUD budget, it's also important to keep in mind that context matters. And we can look at the numbers pretty closely, but HUD's really thinking about their legacy beyond these budget numbers. And they really want to think about breaking down silos in programs and having these programs work better together on the ground and in the federal government. They want to think about programs working better across agencies. And so that's one of their big emphasis areas. And their final point of that is that HUD really talks about increasing opportunity for low-income neighborhood residents. And that's a big point across all of HUD's budget. And there's been a lot of recent studies coming out, Raj Chetty being one of the main ones, saying that where you live, your zip code matters for opportunity. And HUD wants to talk about creating opportunity across education, HUD, and other agencies. So within the HUD budget, nearly all HUD programs are slated for increased or level funding, and CDBG, Community Development Block Grants, are the one program that are slated for a decrease, about $200 million. The HOME program, which I know a lot of you are familiar with, was a major battle last year. The Senate Appropriations Committee essentially decided to zero out HOME. They reduced it from about $1 billion down to $60 million or so, which essentially would have killed the program. And a lot of advocates across the country for the HOME program really spoke up and made it clear that HOME is important to a lot of folks, and that the rural advocates were a big part of that conversation and talking to the House and Senate and saying this is important to rural areas. And so the HUD ask overall is for $48.9 billion. That's an increase over last year. But the really big news out of the HUD budget, which I'll get to in a little bit, is the mandatory funding that the President has requested. So again, looking at the chart for some specific programs at home and CDBG, the SHOP program, which we'll talk about a little bit later, which is a program that organizations such as HAC and other organizations use to fund the infrastructure and land acquisition costs for self-help housing, is slated for level funding. Once again, the administration wants HAC to be a carve-out of home, and in past years, Congress has rejected that proposal. So also choice neighborhoods in the President's budget. The President is asking for quite an increase in that. And the choice neighborhoods, which I'll go into some more detail on this later, is really an iteration of the President's desire to address poverty at a multi-generational level, at the neighborhood level, and across silos. And that's a lot of what choice neighborhoods seeks to do if you read the budget justifications. And a couple other programs, Indian Housing Block Grants and Homeless Assistance, McKinney-Vento, are slated for increases. And the housing opportunities for people with persons with AIDS, it's level funded, but they do seek some changes in their formula, which you might, if you're interested in that program, you might want to look at the formula changes as well. So going through other programs, I won't go through every funding level, but you will see that some have gotten increases, some are more level funding, and also keep in mind inflation. So if you see level funding, but then you factor in inflation and the number of folks that need to be served, it could actually be viewed as a decrease. It's the same way if you look at inflation over the years, programs like CDBG and Home, those programs adjusted for inflation are funding at much, much less than they used to be. And one other note before I get to my notes on the HUD budget is that the HUD budget, 85% of it is really just renewing existing rent assistance programs that help people pay their basic rent. And within that, the National Low Income Housing Coalition and other advocates, including the HUD Secretary, note that those programs are only reaching one out of four people who are eligible for such programs. And so the President's budget does try to address that a little bit with a few increased discretionary dollars for things like vouchers and for families with children. But the big news out of the President's budget for folks who are in the housing and community development community is that he proposed $11 billion over 10 years in mandatory spending to address homelessness, and that's through vouchers and rapid rehousing. And that's a big shift. Mandatory spending is not subject to the budget battles every year as much. It's still congressionally mandated spending, but the rest of the HUD budget is discretionary spending, meaning it's subject to caps, budget constraints, and other things. Mandatory programs in the budget are normally like entitlement programs, Medicaid, Medicare, food stamps, and that these aren't touched as much, so to speak, by Congress. And so shifting some of the housing vouchers, for example, to that program or that proposal, that's very big news. Also, for those of you who follow HUD a lot, affirmatively furthering fair housing rule, getting that up and going, so to speak, the enforcement and the enactment of that is also part of the HUD's budget, and HUD feels confident they have the necessary resources to enact that law. And again, HUD talks a lot about place-based initiatives, creating a legacy of working across agencies to address poverty. And if you read the HUD budget, they include references to the Department of Treasury budget, to the Health and Human Services budget, and they really want to think about things like that. Finally, for the colonial areas, which are a big focal point for HAC's work, again this year, HUD asked to increase the budget there by 10 to 15% within state allocations for California, New Mexico, Arizona, and Texas. And this program was proposed by the administration last year, this change, but Congress did not enact it. So the Upward Mobility Project, another proposal of the Obama administration, again, aligned with what they've been talking about. They proposed it last year. It was not accepted by Congress. But they would want state, localities, or consortia to be able to combine programs, including the programs out of HHS, Social Services Block Grants, and Community Services Block Grants with Home and CDBG, and try to find some creative ways to address poverty. Another proposal is local housing policy grants, and it's kind of vague language here, but then if you read deeper into it, they really believe that regionalism and flexibility are really, really important to addressing some of the long-standing housing issues, and they believe that local housing policy grants would help HUD get to this. Again, the rural programs in the President's budget, there used to be a Rural Innovation Fund in HUD, and this year is not funded. It hasn't been in the past few years. The RHED program, Rural Housing Economic Development Program, which brought some capacities to high-needs rural communities, is no longer funded in the HUD budget. And the Rural Capacity Building Program, RCB, which again brings some capacity to groups to really deliver to rural areas, is not funded in the HUD budget. And the SHOP program, which I mentioned earlier, it's proposed as a set-aside within the home program, and Congress has always rejected this proposal in the past and chosen to fund SHOP as more of its own program and not within the home umbrella. And I brought up this next slide, HUD's Revitalization Initiative, and if you read the language on there, the neighborhood revitalization language, you'll see some key words like access to capital, persistent crime, other challenges that perpetuate the need for an integrated approach for residents to reach their full potential. So if you want one bottom line talking point from HUD's budget, it's that they want you to think along getting outside of silos, and they want to think about place-based and really solving things at a more than one program or one agency level. And I see a few questions that popped up, and I think we're done with the HUD portion. So
Stephen, do you want to go ahead and answer Tom's question where he types, what are localities?
Yes, and I think that Tom is referring to the mention of localities in the local housing policy grants program. I assume that's right, Tom. And localities and regional coalitions, I think from reading the budget justification for that today and a little bit more detail on HUD's website, and localities could mean local communities or it could mean counties, and they weren't too specific in talking about that, but I can give you some more detail and look a little bit closer at that if that's helpful.
Does the funding go to local governments?
It seems pretty localities or regional coalitions, so it sounds as though governments could develop consortia, partnerships across sectors to really address these problems creatively. And what HUD is basically saying is that the existing silos and existing government boundaries thwart creative solutions to long-standing housing problems. And so they want people to break down barriers and think in coalitions across lines.
If I can ask Stephen a question, even though that's a proposed new program.
It is.
Is it really likely that Congress is going to accept and adopt any of
the programs? $300 million is a lot of money for starters, and this is not a budget year where folks are expecting a lot of increases. And secondly, this is almost identical to a program proposed last year, and Congress did not seem keen on it, from what I could tell. So I think the chances of enacting it are probably quite slim.
Okay, Stephen, there's a second question that's in the chat box, and we are planning to unmute the lines here so that you can ask Stephen and Leslie questions, but we're going to address the questions that are in the chat box first. So Stephen there and Leslie, there's a second question. What about cuts to the CHODO set-aside?
Sure, and Tom, it's a good question, and that has, here at HAC, we have been looking at that, and Jeff Mosley here at HAC has been looking at closer at that. He's in our Training and Technical Assistance Division. And from HUD's budget document, I have that in front of me, and it says the home statute requires that not less than 15% of each participating jurisdictions grant be reserved for projects owned or sponsored by CHODOs. HUD says it's extremely difficult for participating jurisdictions receiving smaller and smaller allocations to administer the 15% set aside. And that's what HUD's saying. It's getting harder and harder for smaller jurisdictions to administer that. And so that's what HUD thinks.
But it's not proposing to do away with it? Doesn't sound like it.
Yeah, they want to do away with the set-aside, basically. Within CHODO, there's a 15% set-aside for CHODOs within home, and they want to do away with that set-aside. And I don't get the impression Congress will be keen on this proposal. That's merely a prediction. And looking at the rest of what you're saying, Tom.
All right, so since there are no additional questions in the chat box, what we are planning to do now is unmute all the lines. And what I will ask before we unmute the lines is that if you are not planning to ask a question, please mute your lines locally so that we don't get all the feedback. So at this point, I'm going to go ahead and unmute all the lines so that you can verbally ask questions of Leslie and Stephen. Anyone with questions out there, please?
While folks are thinking of questions, I will make one quick mention that there's also the National Housing Trust Fund, and that's not, the funding for that comes from the GSD proceeds, essentially, profits, whatever you want to call it. But that's not out of the same pot of money as what we've been talking about, but the funding for that does go to low-income housing production, essentially. And at the end of February, the administration will release the final number of what will be available in the National Housing Trust Fund, and estimates, I think, are in the $150 million range, just FYI.
All right, there's a combination of a question and a statement where Tom writes, it sounds like the administration, with the elimination of the CHODO set-aside and choosing localities, which can likely be public entities. Leslie or Stephen?
I'm not sure I understand the question. Tom says, disappointing they are choosing public entities versus nonprofits. Yes.
Yeah.
Not sure what else to say about that.
Okay. Well,
I
Jenny.
think, go ahead, enough, yeah.
I'm sorry. Jenny also has a question. She wants to know, what was the budget for rural capacity building? Was it zero?
Yes, correct. And if memory serves me correctly, and folks who've been around longer it's generally always zeroed out in the president's budget. I think that's been true across administrations, if that's fair to say.
It's a new program, so it hasn't been under previous administration.
That's right, 2000. Okay, yes. But, yes, it is zeroed out. The last few years, it's funded at $5 million, which is a pretty small HUD program. And if you read HUD's budget language, they're essentially saying that they want to move these capacity building programs away from being tied to programmatic goals and more to the reach of a different account in HUD, et cetera, et cetera. The bottom line means it's zeroed out in the budget.
It would be folded in with other technical assistance funding.
Looks like we have another question being typed into the chat box. Do we have any verbal questions for Leslie and Stephen?
Explained everything so very clearly.
It looks that way. So if there are no questions being written, non-verbally coming in, we will move to wrap up today's webinar. And so just quickly before we wrap up today's webinar, I want to remind everyone that both the recording and material will be available on HAC's website. Please also be on the lookout for an email containing a link to a survey for the webinar. This lets HAC know that we are delivering topics that are relevant to your work. I would also like to thank both Leslie and Stephen for their time and information today. Leslie and Stephen, do either of you have any additional thoughts that you'd like to convey before we wrap up?
One thing I will add is that the President's Budget Justifications, if you have an interest in a specific program, the HUD website, and Dan is also going to tweet this in HUD's account, has some really good information there if you want to dig deeper.
Okay, well, there is one really quick question. Claudia wants to know how she can get a copy of the PowerPoint. It will be accessible via HAC's website for download. And so with that being said, I'd like to thank everyone for joining us for today's webinar and wish all of you a good rest of your afternoon. Thank you.